Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something I absolutely love talking about, the architecture of market power. We're going to completely demystify how monopolies actually operate, leaning on some fantastic economic frameworks from the University of Johannesburg. If you've ever looked at a massive company and wondered, how on earth do they dominate an entire industry, dictate prices, and build these literal economic fortresses around their profits, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're taking those complex economic graphs and breaking them down into totally clear, digestible insights. Let's get into it.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. 1, the market power spectrum. 2, how monopolies arise. 3, setting the price. 4, maximizing monopoly profit. 5, monopoly versus competition. And finally, 6, discrimination and regulation.
Section 1. The Market Power Spectrum.
So, if you look at the far left of the imperfect competition spectrum, you've got perfect competition. That's your typical setup with many small, similar firms fighting it out. But as you move to the right, market power starts to seriously increase. You pass monopolistic competition, where firms rely heavily on branding, and then oligopolies, which are just a few really powerful firms, but keep going right. Standing entirely on its own at the very edge of the spectrum is the pure monopoly. It's totally distinct from perfect competition because we're looking at just one single, incredibly powerful firm that completely dominates the entire space. Now, how do we actually define this? Officially, a monopoly is a market producing a good or service where absolutely no close substitute exists, and it's protected by a barrier that stops new competitors from jumping in. I really want to emphasize that no close substitutes part. That is the absolute key here. Honestly, if a good has a decent substitute, even if your specific version is only made by you, you're still facing competition from whoever makes that substitute. To be a true, pure monopoly, you stand totally alone. Section 2. How monopolies arise. Let's talk about the moats. You know, those fascinating barriers to entry that protect these corporate castles from being stormed by rivals. A barrier to entry is literally just a constraint that shields a firm from potential competitors. And there are three main types we look at: natural, ownership, and legal. Legal barriers, for instance, create a legal monopoly where competition is actually restricted by law. Think of a public franchise like the U.S. Postal Service delivering first-class mail, or government licenses to practice medicine, or even just holding a patent. Now, this next concept brilliantly illustrates a natural barrier to entry, which creates a natural monopoly. You see this a lot in industries like electricity generation, where the economies of scale are just massive. Check out the numbers here. One giant firm can pump out 4 million units of output at just 5 cents a unit, simply because of their massive scale. But if you try to split that exact same 4 million units between two smaller firms doing 2 million each, their cost suddenly skyrockets to 10 cents per unit. So one massive firm is undeniably more efficient, and that naturally creates a monopoly because they can supply the whole market at the absolute lowest possible cost. Then you have the ownership barrier to entry. This happens when one single firm owns a massive chunk of a critical resource. To bring in a bit of South African context, think about De Beers during the last century. They essentially cornered the entire global diamond market simply by hoarding the physical resource. At one point, they owned 90% of the world's diamonds. And obviously, when you physically own the very materials needed to compete, well, nobody else can even get a foot in the door.
Section 3, setting the price. Okay, so for a monopoly to figure out how much to sell, it has to pick the right price. And they typically use one of two core strategies. First is a single price monopoly, where the firm just sells every single unit for the exact same price to everybody. The second strategy is price discrimination, which is the practice of selling different units of the exact same good or service for different prices to different people. Keep these two clearly contrasted in your mind, and definitely remember that second one, because we are going to dive into the sneaky world of price discrimination a little bit later.
But for right now, let's focus strictly on the single price strategy. And I want to pose a totally counterintuitive question to you. For a single price monopoly, why is marginal revenue, which is the change in total revenue from selling just one more unit, why is it always less than the price? Like, why does the equation MR is less than P always hold true? It feels weird, right? Well, the answer lies right in the demand curve. See, under perfect competition, a firm is just a price taker. Their demand line is perfectly flat, which means price equals average revenue, which equals marginal revenue. But a monopoly is a price maker. Because they are the only game in town, the demand for their output literally is the entire market demand curve, and that curve slopes downward.
Consumers only have so much money, so to sell a larger volume, a monopoly absolutely has to lower its price. And since they are a single-price monopoly, lowering the price to snag that next customer means they have to lower the price for all customers. That dynamic drags the marginal revenue down, so it's actually lower than the price tag itself.
Section 4. Maximizing monopoly profit.
Before we maximize profit, we have to understand the costs. Take a look at that pink line swooping upward. That is the monopoly's marginal cost, or MC curve. And it's kind of surprising, but a monopoly actually faces the exact same types of technological constraints as a highly competitive firm. In a perfectly competitive market, the supply curve is really just the horizontal sum of all those individual marginal cost curves. For our monopolist here, this pink MC curve acts as their primary constraint.
So how do they actually decide how much to produce? Believe it or not, a monopoly picks its profit-maximizing quantity the exact same way a competitive firm does. The absolute golden rule in microeconomics is this. You always find exactly where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, MR equals MC. Once they pin down that quantity, step 2 is setting the price at the absolute highest level the demand curve will possibly let them get away with.
Let's actually trace this logic in action using a haircut monopoly as an example. First, we find where the orange marginal revenue line perfectly intersects the pink marginal cost line. And you can see that happens right at a quantity of 3 haircuts per hour. But wait, don't stop there. The monopolist does not charge the price at that intersection point. Instead, you draw a dotted line straight up from 3 until you hit that blue demand curve. Then look straight across to the left axis, and boom, the highest price they can possibly charge to sell those 3 haircuts is $14.
Now, the fun part, calculating the winnings. I want to guide your eyes to that beautifully highlighted blue box. To figure out the actual profit, we need the average total cost, the ATC curve, which is that light blue swooping line you see. At a quantity of 3, the ATC is exactly $10. So they're charging $14, but it only costs them an average of $10 to produce. That leaves a sweet $4 profit per haircut. Multiply that $4 profit by the 3 haircuts they're producing, and you get exactly $12 in total economic profit. And that is represented perfectly by the area of that blue rectangle. That right there is the architecture of monopoly profit.
Section 5. Monopoly versus competition. Let's compare these two models side by side to really see the impact. On the left, in perfect competition, equilibrium happens naturally right where the market demand curve meets the market supply curve. That magical intersection gives us quantity Q and price P. But look over at the right. When the market becomes a monopoly, the firm doesn't care at all about where demand meets supply. They only care about where marginal revenue meets marginal cost. Notice how that equilibrium point dramatically shifts up and to the left when marginal revenue is calling the shots?
So here is the crucial takeaway, the real so what of this whole thing. Compared to perfect competition, a single price monopoly produces a smaller output, QM instead of QC, and it charges a much higher price, PM instead of PC. This really drives home the stark market inefficiency that gets created by a monopoly's pricing power. They intentionally restrict output to artificially inflate the price, pocketing that economic profit for themselves right at the expense of everyday consumers.
Section 6. Discrimination and regulation. Remember earlier when we mentioned price discrimination? Well, to actually pull this off and charge different people different prices, a monopoly has to strictly follow 2 dual rules. Number 1, they must be able to identify and separate different types of buyers. And number 2, they absolutely must sell a product that cannot be easily resold. Because otherwise, the people getting the cheap price would just turn around and sell it to the people facing the high price. And just as a quick, neutral reminder here, price differences that happen purely because of actual differences in manufacturing or delivery costs, that's not price discrimination. It's only true discrimination when the underlying product is exactly the same, but the price tag changes depending on who's buying. Because monopolies can cause lower output, higher prices, and intense price discrimination, governments very often step in. So we typically see 2 administrative forces at play here. First is regulation, which involves rules administered by a government agency to objectively influence prices, quantities, who can enter the market, and other economic activities to protect consumers. On the flip side, we have deregulation, which is the process of stripping away those rules from a firm or industry, often to try and spur innovation or just cut through the red tape. These 2 forces are basically in a constant tug of war over our major industries. So we've seen the moats, we've traced the curves, and we've calculated the profits. But I really want to leave you with this final thought. As modern market dynamics evolve globally, especially with new technology and massive data, will perfect competition ever truly exist? Or are our future markets just destined to be shaped by completely new, digital barriers to entry that we haven't even named yet? Keep a close eye on the market, because the architecture of power is always shifting. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.